Good morning and welcome, speakers and audience members, to the 16th All Energy and Decarbonise webinar. This morning, we're considering energy integration in the UK continental shelf. How will the basin evolve? What a great way to start a Wednesday morning. I'm Judith Patton, Project Director of our duo of shows and the co-creator of All Energy way back at the start of the century. While I talk briefly, my slides will help you get the greatest benefit possible during your time with us today. And afterwards, what is important is that if you would like to ask questions, take part in a poll, and there's one coming up very shortly, or rate this webinar, you shrink your screen from full screen to be able to see where to do all three things. Oh, and that you'll consider joining us this afternoon when we look at corporate PPAs, broadening the discussion. Just a brief trip down memory lane. I spent a quarter of a century working first as PR consultant to and then PR and marketing director of Offshore Europe, working with its inspirational creator David Stott at Spearhead Exhibitions. When he retired in 1999, we had one much hoped for unfinished task. We both believed that the time was right to hold a renewables exhibition and conference. The pieces fell into place in early 2000 thanks to a conversation I had with Rita Stephen of the Economic Development Unit at Aberdeen City Council, and followed up with a marvellous session with Jeremy Cresswell, now emeritus editor of the Press and Journal's Energy, who I hope and believe is in the audience today. I've often described him as All Energy's midwife. Very early on, we tried running a technology transfer session at the brand new and shiny bright All Energy. Sadly, we never really got the uptake we'd hoped for. Neither side of the energy coin was quite ready. So I'm particularly excited that today, with Carlo Procaccini's hand on the tiller and a stellar group of experts, we're looking at the real deal, energy integration. We'd planned a similar session for the May conference, and I'd like to thank the Oil and Gas Authority for encouraging me to think of this as a great topic for a webinar. With over 300 people, 314 to be exact, in the audience, they were right. Without more ado, I'd first of all like to wish you and your families good health, and then pass over to Carlo, who is Head of Technology at the Oil and Gas Authority, with a remit, lucky man, that covers technology and innovation for the UKCS, from R&D to final deployment, as well as energy transition. Over to you, Carlo, and your first poll, and your stellar cast of speakers.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Judith, for the introduction. Firstly, I'd like to thank All Energy for pulling together this excellent webinar, gathering a very large audience. We are 350 around this webinar today, I was just told. The webinars, in my opinion, are a key tool in the time of COVID to keep our energy industry discussing, debating issues, and the flow of thoughts that are going to enable us to address the future challenges of our industry. So very grateful to companies that organize webinars and All Energy for this meeting this morning. We have an excellent panel today. We representing government stakeholders, industry and technology organization. I will introduce them one by one when they speak. They will, can we go to the first slide, please? The topic of today is the recognizing the opportunities that we have in our UK continental shelf to support the UK net zero ambitions. And we're going to discuss different energy solutions and different energy sources that can actually be delivered efficiently and effectively in the North Sea, from continuing oil and gas activity to carbon capture and storage and wind power, renewables. And we're going to do this with the panel representing the government, the industry, and technology development. Can I see the second slide, please? Thank you. We will have Bethan Vasey from Shell, Myrtle Dowes from the Oil and Gas Technology Centre, Colin McKeever from Crown Estate Scotland, and Will Apps from the Crown Estate, giving a short presentation, then we'll go into panel discussion. I'll give a brief introduction about our stellar panelists before they present. Now we have a quick poll of the audience, I believe. Very good. So I can see that the poll is actually going. I can see on a separate screen that the poll is actually progressing. So thank you very much for giving us, we asked you 2 questions, and thank you very much for giving us your feedback. Let's go to my introduction presentation, please. Recently, the Oil and Gas Authority, in collaboration with other parts of government, BEIS, Crown Estate, Ofgem, and others, Crown Estate Scotland, and other regulators, ran a project to look at the opportunities for integration of different energy sources offshore and their contribution to the net zero, UK net zero targets. I'm going to briefly touch on the findings from this project, just as a starting point for the discussion, more in-depth discussion into the different energy solutions. Can we go to the first slide, please? The UK has set world-leading targets of emission abatement for the country. Net zero by 2050 is a world-leading target. That is supported by a very clear clean growth strategy, which is part of our industrial strategy, that charts the way which we can achieve that target. Among the key planks of the clean growth strategy, there are the use of new technologies like carbon capture and storage, growing offshore wind power, and then developing a hydrogen economy, both supply and demand. That is supported by commitment by the government in forms of policy and funding. Just showing some examples of the funding. For instance, a focus on decarbonizing industrial clusters and upgrading the energy infrastructure. Can we go to the next slide, please? The Energy Integration Project looked at a number of technologies that bring together efficiently different energy sources to transition into towards net zero targets. As I mentioned, it was run together by the OGA with other regulators. It was a true cross-government collaboration. The findings were published in August, and they're available on our website. The technologies we looked at included bringing together different operations offshore in terms of electricity generation and usage. So electrification of offshore platforms powered by wind or other renewable sources, their connection to the grid, and therefore the sharing of infrastructure to allow a faster growth of offshore renewables and wind power. Second technology was carbon capture and storage, which I will cover. That is a particularly attractive bridge solution to achieve net zero from the speed at which it can be deployed, but also from the ability that we have to use the offshore environment to do that efficiently. Hydrogen, green hydrogen and blue hydrogen, I'll touch on those, what it means, basically decarbonizing natural gas, that's the blue hydrogen, and then generating hydrogen from wind power, the green hydrogen. The energy hubs bring all these technologies together because there are strong synergies between the different sources of energy, renewable and conventional, that can facilitate and enable an effective transition. Go to the next slide, please. The opportunities will be regional because they will depend on the distribution of the energy sources or the emission sources. They will depend on the ability to connect to existing infrastructure and leverage existing infrastructure, or having to build new infrastructure, and also the proximity to the energy demand centers. So therefore, carbon capture and storage would probably be more located around industrial clusters where the largest sources are. Integration between oil and gas and offshore wind power will take place in regions where we have a long-lasting oil and gas operations, such as in the central North Sea and in other areas in the north. And then the green hydrogen, as it's flagged on the map, will be related to where the largest production of offshore wind and renewables power will be located as a way of storing and transmitting the power to the demand centers. Go to the next slide, please. The main finding by the offshore capabilities of industries that are operating offshore, wind industry, wind power industry, oil and gas industry, and so on, we might be able to give a 60% contribution to the net zero carbon emission abatement target of the UK, because of the technology can be phased in over time, and that can be done in an economically efficient way, precisely because we have this big resource, which is our offshore environment, where several of these technologies can be built. Can we go to the next slide, please? Starting from one example, in electrification, there are big synergies that are possible because of the co-location of oil and gas operation, the proximity of oil and gas operations, and where the wind power will expand into. And that should allow our industry to reduce about 3 million, about a third of its power generation emissions over time. But at the same time, co-invest with the wind farm industry in transmission infrastructure and other equipment. Can we go to the next slide, please? Carbon capture and storage is where our subsurface, our offshore province, has a prolific subsurface in terms of storage capacity. The overall storage capacity, which at this point in time is potential storage capacity, needs to be, of course, to be fully understood and qualified. But this potential storage capacity would last for the UK needs for hundreds of years, 78 gigatons of CO2 storage capacity. The distribution is in proximity of the oil and gas regions. Therefore, there is a level of existing infrastructure that would allow to reduce the costs of the CCS schemes. Go to the next slide, please. Hydrogen is going to be a very important part of the solution because it would allow the decarbonization of a number of energy uses where gas is the main source of power in terms of gas distribution and gas use. And hydrogen can be replaced to partial or full extent. Can be a replacement of natural gas over time. Therefore, there are big growth expectations on hydrogen. I showed just a trend in the chart. Hydrogen by 2050 accounting for between 30 and 40% of the natural gas consumption of today. Therefore, having displaced certainly a large amount of natural gas for our uses. But where will that hydrogen come from? The blue and the green hydrogen solutions represent a reforming of natural gas into hydrogen. That's the blue hydrogen, which can more quickly ramp up because it can be done today with existing technology and leverage some of the infrastructure that oil and gas has deployed over the years on the UKCS. And the green hydrogen, which is the electrolysis of water using renewable power, will be another important solution to deal with intermittency of renewable power sources, and also with the question about efficiently transporting or transmitting energy over long distances. So a combination of the two sources will give an opportunity to the UK to supply the hydrogen that will be needed by 2050. Next slide, please. Where is this going to take place? In terms of the blue hydrogen growth, around of course, to be expected that that will grow around the industrial clusters where there is a concentration of infrastructure. There will be a concentration of infrastructure in terms of carbon dioxide capturing and an eventual disposal in offshore reservoirs. And blue hydrogen will need to share that infrastructure for the disposal of the CO2 that is generated from methane reforming. Go to the next slide, please. And green hydrogen growth will be dependent on the growth of offshore wind power that we all know has very ambitious plans as the next speakers will talk about. And we envision that there's going to be a certain percentage of the overall wind power generated that will need to be transformed in hydrogen to deal with intermittency problems and long distance transmission issues. Go to the next slide, please. The good news is that the industry is really ramping up its activity on a number of pilots that are covering all the technologies that I mentioned before. Here's just a summary map of some notable pilots that are currently being discussed by industry with the government. We'll go to the next slide, please. Our priorities going forward will be to making sure that those pilots accelerate in this decade, and that by the end of the decade, we have true commercial scale schemes that include all the technologies that I mentioned before and that are operating and already give a material contribution to achieving the UK net zero target. So it's very important what will happen in this decade, because in this decade, we also have an opportunity of leveraging existing infrastructure from the oil and gas and conventional power industries. And this is an opportunity which is, of course, time-bound. The more we go forward, the less infrastructure we have. From the government side, our priority is to making sure that we anticipate the need for regulatory processes and answers that the industry are actually posing to us, because these schemes will involve collaboration among different industries and also coordination among different government parts, as you will appreciate in later discussions today. So the point is to grow momentum, maintain momentum in this decade, to ensure that we are on the right trajectory for net zero. I'd like to thank you for your time, and I'd like to introduce the next speaker. So I guess we have to bring Bethan.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Carlo, for inviting me. It's great to join this virtual All Energy webinar, a theme which is very much about working together. And I really look forward to hearing from Colin, Will, and Myrtle later. I'm based in our upstream operations in Aberdeen, and I lead the recently formed Energy Transition Team, which is actively focused on reducing our own operational emissions and also on new business opportunities which will deliver on the energy transition, including CCS and hydrogen. At Shell, we very much want to be part of the energy transition. We recognise that we are on a pathway to a lower carbon future. The challenges of the world faces today because of the COVID pandemic have not changed the long-term challenge of climate change, and the world needs to move fast to transform its energy systems. Earlier this year, Shell set itself a global ambition to become, by 2050 or sooner, a net zero emissions energy business across scopes 1, 2, and 3, in line with society. I'm passionate about working together to deliver on net zero and would like to cover 3 topics today. the role of the UK oil and gas industry as a partner to help deliver on UK net zero, the potential of offshore energy integration, and the dilemmas and challenges around electrification. So first of all, we believe that the oil and gas industry has a significant role to play in supporting the UK and Scotland achieve net zero. Oil and gas has a 50-year track record of innovation, hundreds of thousands of skilled people, and the determination to deliver world-class energy projects. The industry very much has the skills and the expertise to drive new partnerships for the future energy transition at pace. But we need to earn the right to play that role, demonstrating tangible and concrete actions today, decarbonising our own operations, and supporting other sectors to decarbonise that are today heavily reliant on our products. The OGUK and the energy industry in the North Sea has shown real leadership and by setting ambitious targets to lower its own emissions. Our industry has committed to working with government and regulators to achieve a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and to be a net zero basin by 2050. But I believe this is only the start. Emissions from the production of oil and gas account for around 4% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. However, the consumption of hydrocarbons accounts for 80% of the UK's emissions in 4 key sectors: industry, heating, power, and transport. So how can we together deliver solutions to reduce emissions across all of these sectors which society needs? Now, moving on to offshore integration. I welcome the OGA's report. It paints a vivid picture of the potential role how existing oil and gas infrastructure can complement and supplement renewables offshore, reducing emissions from oil and gas production and growing the UK's renewables capacity. The headline figures are exciting, potentially directly contributing to a 30% reduction in the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. And we at Shell are already in action on energy integration. I'd like to highlight 3 key examples. Firstly, onshore, Shell are one of the technical partners in the Acorn project run by Pale Blue Dot, which is looking to deliver a major carbon capture and storage hub at St Fergus with the potential for hydrogen production and transport and storage of CO2 from elsewhere. Secondly, in the southern North Sea, a number of our platforms are already powered by a hybrid of renewables and diesel generators. And thirdly, in the central North Sea, Shell, alongside a number of other operators, are considering the feasibility of electrification of a number of our assets. I'm really excited to see the focus on energy integration, but I do want to sound a note of caution. There is lots of work required to translate potential into reality. And so we need to think, what are the key technical, commercial, and regulatory solutions required to deliver this? We know we need to continue the pace in making progress on policy and regulatory frameworks needed to release investment and mature projects, whether CCS, hydrogen, or electrification, and these will help us all get to net zero. Finally, I would like to zoom in on electrification. This has the potential, as Carlo mentioned, to deliver millions of tons of CO2 reduction. But asset electrification presents a dilemma for the industry. We have a mature asset base. And thinking of our 2030 targets, I'm looking for quick wins and investments that we can make in the next 1 to 2 years. In terms of the long investment cycles that we're used to in our industry, 2030 is actually just around the corner. If I break down the key elements of most projects, they are capital investment, power cost, and carbon price. If I look at brownfield electrification investment decisions on the current premises of these items, they are not investable. But we know there is an imperative to act now. So what can we do to translate the intent into investment? All of this speaks to the importance of the North Sea Transition Deal to galvanise industry and government actions to support jobs and the supply chain through the transition, and for us collectively as an industry to know where to focus and where to collaborate. So in conclusion, the oil and gas industry has a significant role to play in the energy transition. Offshore energy integration offers great potential, and we really need to work together to address the dilemmas and galvanise actions. Thank you. Over to you, Carlo.
Thank you very much, Bethan, for bringing us the views of the industry. Our next speaker is Will Apps, is the head of energy development at the Crown Estate. And Will, to you.
Good morning, all, and thank you, Carlo and Bethan, for your introductions. So my name is Will Apps. I head up energy development at the Crown Estate. Most of my time is spent on offshore wind, but as is a sign of what we're talking about here, more and more is being pulled into what we would call this integration. I had the pleasure of joining Carlo on the programme board for the energy integration project, and it's been it's an incredible journey that we're on here, and there's some really important words that Bethan talked to in terms of how do we make the reality. But taking on the polls that happen, my job right now for the next 5 or so minutes is just to sort of step back and give you an understanding of the expansion of offshore wind, particularly as one of the biggest and most promising renewables position, as probably most of you are aware. I'll talk about why is that the case, because those fundamentals come to bear. And also, not only in terms of the integration being important for, I guess, the overall system, but really important in terms of how we start to consider project business cases. And the real theme that's going to come through, I think, a lot of the presentations and has to date, is the importance of us all coming together, whether that's government, regulators, I guess those national actors, which is the Crown Estate in this regard, and I'll tell you a bit more about our role in a minute, but also the sector. Because what's really important is that as we go through the integration, the imperatives of net zero, there are other pressures that come to bear, be that biodiversity, ensuring we do this in cognizance of the environment, how we work together with a very busy sea space, a point I'll come back to again in a minute, and also think about our impact on society, whether that's directly in terms of where we build, but also in terms of what it means to levelling up agenda, for example, ensuring jobs and prosperity. Again, a theme that's going strong, and all comes together to create quite a busy space. But the answer here is in starting to programize these actions. And I think that's the point here. We have a really good promise. We have a really good intent. But again, talking to Bethan's theme, the important thing now is to try and create clarity on what actions need to be taken by who, and together we come forwards. Just to give you a bit more about our role as a Crown Estate, if the slide moves, there we go. So the Crown Estate, we're an independent commercial business, as the slide talks to here. We create a profit. We have a commercial mandate through an Act of Parliament, and our profit returns to Treasury. So essentially gets used, goes back to the central government funds, and we have a commercial mandate where all of our net revenue goes to Treasury. Essentially, we are 100% taxpayer, is probably the simplest way of putting that. And we have a mandate to look after our capital, after our estates and the capital value of that for perpetuity. And that's a really interesting point. Therefore, we are a business that really is interested in the long-term view and taking actions today, which really mean to make something not only in terms of where we will be in 2030, but ultimately out to sort of, whether that's 2050 or those ultimate horizons. Our role, we have a very diverse portfolio, but the main message around today is what we do in terms of offshore. And so we manage the seabed for England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And you're about to hear from Colin from Crown Estate Scotland, who do the same role as we do, completely independently for Scottish Waters. And I'll let Colin talk about his role shortly. And really key for us, we kind of sit in this middle ground. We're not part of government. but we sit alongside government in terms of the policy, be that energy policy through kind of the core role of BEIS, but also growing in terms of what it means to do that in environmental sense in terms of DEFRA, the environmental department. And then obviously there are points where we play alongside the devolved governance administrations and also the regulators. And I think that's the point here, alongside the stakeholders, whether those are statutory stakeholders, NGOs, local authorities, government and the customers we see here. That's a very good summary of sorts of the actors that need to come together to tackle the issues that we are talking about today in an integrated way, cognizant of what we're trying to achieve in terms of net zero, but also those other pressures I've talked to, including safe systems of work. How do we come together to deliver an integrated energy picture, not just concentrating on probably one vector of power, thinking about transport and thinking about heat, and thinking about how those solutions cross many industries, not just thinking about offshore wind as a sector. So part of my brief is to give you an update on where we are in offshore wind. The graph on the left-hand side of this slide talks to where we are in terms of the portfolio. Some big numbers, gigawatts. So 1 gigawatt particularly will power about 1% of power demand. So as we speak now, there's around 10 gigawatts of operating projects, both in the seas that we manage as Crown Estate and that managed by Crown Estate Scotland. So at the moment, offshore wind is delivering about 10% of our power requirements. Behind that, there's another 10 gigawatts, which is committed. What that means is it's got its financial support, typically through a contract for difference, government-backed contract for a competition-led strike price. I'll come back to pricing in a minute. So essentially, we have a firm pipeline of what you might call committed projects of around 20 gigawatts. There's another 15 gigawatts under development, and that is increasing every day. So those are those projects that are in the consenting process, sorting out their grid connection. They have formal rights on the seabed, again, either through us or Crown Estate Scotland, and they are investing in the process of getting consent, securing their grid, and then ultimately competing for a grid connection, for a CFD. And then behind that, there are a couple of processes running at the moment from our point of view. One is the extensions process, where we invited existing projects to extend. And in fact, this slide's a little bit out of date because we've now, as a result of last week, closed out all of the agreements for lease, so the lease options for those projects. So just under 3 gigawatts now moves into under development to increase that number. We're currently working on round 4 offshore wind, which we are aiming to secure about at least 7 gigawatts over the coming year or so as we complete the tender process, complete the environmental assessment we're required to do before award. Now, on top of that, you have the work that Colin will talk to in a minute on ScotWind, so their leasing process, which will add to that 10. To put that in the context of policy, currently there's firm policy around 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. That means government has set an expectation of contract for difference auction rounds over the course of the 2020s to secure that level of deployment. And last year, in reaction to net zero and the commitment that Carlo talked about at the outset, government are talking about an increase of ambition of 40 gigawatts. Shortly from government or from BEIS, there'll be an energy white paper, and whose guess is as good as mine. But maybe we'll see something coming out around that ambition within there. But currently sits as an ambition that government are working to for offshore wind in the context of net zero. Finally, I guess the really important thing is, what does it mean to go further? Committee for Climate Change talked about the net zero position last year in advance of UK making the legal commitments. And that talked about deployment in excess of 75 gigawatts. And the real challenge, people will start talking about challenges, is where do we find the space to do that? And how do we work alongside environmental designations, a very busy sea space, and how do we work alongside other industries to ensure we can secure that space well and responsibly? I'll quickly go through the those core issues that are driving the offshore wind sector at the moment. Cost reduction has been fundamental. And we're now in a situation where projects are winning contracts at below £50 per megawatt hour, which is below or on par with what we would call conventional energy cost. So essentially that has put the ingredients forwards for offshore wind to be penned as one of the most important industries in terms of putting together the renewable energy and the volume of energy supply required. So the industry has done an incredible job in bringing down those costs, driven by things such as innovation in turbines, cost of capital, and well-delivered, on-time delivery, managing those risks. I've outlined the policy ambition, which was the lines on this graph. Key to this, in this theme of programmizing the process and getting the various actors together, was the offshore wind sector deal that was agreed over 2 years ago now, really focused on that expansion for offshore wind. In return for the policy certainty, what were the industry going to be delivering in terms of jobs, productivity, a really big push around innovation, and a key area for us as Crown Estate is making sure that expansion happens in a coordinated and really cognizant of things like biodiversity. And we are just launching now a program working alongside BEIS and DEFRA and 25 stakeholders out there, whether they're NGOs, the statutory conservation bodies, right the way through to the industry and NGOs, to ensure that we can programize, as I say, that approach to the expansion, considering our responsibilities for biodiversity and otherwise. Coordinated transmission, a really key one, and actually a real good example of how we may have got it wrong in the past, to be honest. We've traditionally tackled the expansion of offshore wind and other sectors on a project-by-project approach, not really starting to galvanize and think about a systematic and strategic approach to things like transmission assets. And what happens there is we have an issue that we may have a greater impact on the coastal communities, or those communities for which yet another cable is carrying across the countryside or their back gardens. And so not only do we need to come together to find the answers for a better coordinated, better strategic approach because of the technical challenge of integration, but it's really important we start to get our ducks in order in terms of how do we do that in terms of our impact on the environment and communities, making sure we only build what we need to, not only because it's cheaper, but also because it has a minimized impact. But it requires far more integration, thinking about those interfaces. And I guess a bit of a theme where we're moving to now, not only is offshore wind a good opportunity for the sector in delivering what you would call the core power proposition, it's also really important in terms of when we start to look at the business opportunities for offshore wind in a different cycle. And the future energy scenarios published by National Grid over the summer provide a really good example of that, where they, in one of their scenarios, could point at 23 gigawatts of offshore wind directly connected to electrolyzers. So not coming onto the grid, but actually connected to electrolyzers to deliver the hydrogen that may be required for a net zero scenario. And so there you get to a really interesting prospect of a completely different business case, not connecting to the grid, but a business case where offshore wind is built on the basis of a contract for electrolyzers, not necessarily for a contract for difference or power purchase agreement in the traditional form. And so there's some highlights in terms of where we're going and where we are currently with offshore wind, in which case I will hand back to Carlo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Will. A very interesting presentation that really resonates well with the questions that are flowing in from the audience. Let's move to the next speaker. Colin McKeever is the Offshore Wind Development Manager, Crown Estate Scotland. Colin?
Yeah, hi Carlo, and hi everyone. Thanks very much, Will, for the sort of overview from the offshore wind perspective and of the Crown Estate. So I'm representing Crown Estate Scotland. So you will actually have to listen to these next couple of slides. It's almost the same, as Will said, with a regional accent, but with some really specific and important differences. So unfortunately, you'll have to pay attention to the beginning of my presentation too. So Crown Estate Scotland is a Scottish public body that was established in 2017 following devolution from the Crown Estate. So we manage the Crown Estate assets in Scotland, as Will said, which includes the seabed, and we're our core purpose is to invest in property, natural resources, and people to generate lasting value for Scotland. So we're charged by Scottish ministers to manage the Crown assets in a way that sort of returns revenue back to the Scottish Government and making it available for their public spending. So this slide shows you a kind of snapshot of what we do and an idea of the numbers behind our portfolio, and it sort of indicates a wide reach of responsibility, and we look to manage our assets consistently in a way that delivers for all, including, importantly, a sort of emerging key feature of building a net zero economy and supporting that just transition. So that's the sort of overview to Crown Estate Scotland. The next slide introduces a sort of important element of the Scottish context, which is the distinction between ourselves and Marine Scotland, who are part of the Scottish Government. So we are the seabed manager, and Marine Scotland are the regulator. They're responsible for strategic marine planning, identifying areas of seabed that can be made available on a planned basis. So we look to sort of act as that, in that seabed manager capacity, as a kind of a catalyst, supportive partner. We hold property agreements, and we only allow the transfer into lease once all of the consents and licenses that are required are granted by Marine Scotland or the relevant regulatory authority. Marine Scotland, in addition to their sort of strategic planning role, they look at the environmental considerations, they look at regulatory compliance, and they assess consent applications for renewable projects in Scotland. So Marine Scotland are in the middle of developing a sectoral marine plan for offshore wind, commercial scale offshore wind. They've been working on that for some time to align with their national marine plan. And these areas will define those that are available through our leasing process for new offshore wind seabed rights. So the consultation on that draft plan closed earlier this year. We launched our ScotWind leasing, which I'll come to shortly, and an adopted plan is expected in autumn 2020, so very soon, hopefully. And the final leasing requirements will align with the adopted plans. So we work very closely with Marine Scotland to make sure that we can follow a plan-led process to ensure that everybody's responsibilities are appropriately discharged. So following that plan-led approach for offshore wind, our sort of role as asset manager is as Will outlined, quite similar to that of the Crown Estate, which is to look at the sort of optimised use of the seabed and facilitate that. We have a number of existing leases and property agreements offshore, and as I said earlier, all our profit goes to the Scottish Government Consolidated Fund. So we have a role in sort of managing those agreements that we hold, but also in sort of supporting and promoting projects and sectors which will help to deliver value for the overall estate and for the country. So the main thing that's happening now, Will touched on it briefly, is ScotWind leasing, which is the first opportunity for new commercial scale offshore wind rights in Scotland for a decade, and this will provide provides a route and a process by which applicants can seek new seabed rights for new commercial scale offshore wind farms around Scotland in those areas that were identified in the sectoral marine plan. But I mean, this is a really exciting opportunity for us. It's raised a lot of interest and a lot of ambition, and it seems to be very core to the delivery of Scotland's net zero ambition with the future pipeline and opportunity with offshore wind holds. So the opportunity here is to deliver the large capital projects which can deliver power, and the process is designed to be flexible. Obviously, it's 10 years since the last leasing, and there's been some change to processes, some change to opportunities, some significant development of technology and cost reduction since then. So our process is designed with that sort of future in mind, not to unnecessarily limit the ability of projects to find alternative routes to market, and we're really looking to enable that as part of our wider objectives. So to that end, we've spent some time looking at where we can support and fund the right strategic research, and looking at our offshore wind portfolio. We've been working in partnership to really develop and understand the opportunity with emerging technologies and emerging market solutions, which could offer that significant value to Scotland and contribute to the net zero and energy transition activities that have been introduced earlier today. So the two main areas of study that I'd like to just highlight just now are on floating wind and energy systems. But firstly, we've committed a significant element of funding to work in partnership with the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council. So that's SOEC, another acronym, which is a group that's been developed in partnership with the Scottish public sector and the offshore wind industry. So that's co-chaired by the Scottish Energy Minister, and it looks to really provide a forum and a Scotland-wide response to the well-established and well-developed offshore wind sector deal, and really focus on the shared specific priorities in Scotland to optimise and maximise returns and value for the Scottish industry. We're looking at an opportunity for SOEC to take more of a role in collaboration with other industries and sectors, particularly those linked to energy transition, blue economy, and also net zero. Offshore wind has an important role to play in its production of electricity, but we see that sort of connection at industry to industry level is really important, which is why we've made funding available for deliverables of SOEC, which can contribute towards the SOEC vision and goals, and really looking at increasing deployment opportunity and the value and returns from that. So I just thought it was worth touching on that, as we'll be very busy in the next 6 months or so delivering in partnership with SOEC. And so we're still talking about this. So this was a 2017 piece of work that we commissioned that was published in 2018 along with the Catapult, the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult, making the case and providing a bit more meat to the bones of the macroeconomic opportunity for floating wind development in Scotland. We keep talking about it because it keeps being referenced, and I think it is still extremely relevant because it understands the progress of the technology. It understands the sort of opportunity of government support and the potential outcomes that we're looking at. I mean, many of the areas identified in the sectoral marine plan are for significantly deeper water than the earlier phase project, and this is where floating wind really can make a huge difference to delivering net zero and increasing capacity of the sort of offshore wind market in the UK. So we published this, and it is slightly dated, but it really is worth a read in sort of understanding where the markets come from, where we saw it going, and then complementing that with the focus from the offshore wind industry and helping that floating move from earlier phase into more commercial scale that we hope to see through ScotWind leasing. Another area of focus on a sort of program of work is around energy systems. So this is something that we picked up a couple of years ago, and we've run a number of different specific studies on this, which looks to show how can we decarbonize energy systems in order to make sure that that contribution of green electricity can be optimized and sort of maximized, rather than just the conventional into grid approach. So that can work for sort of rural communities, smaller specific users, but it also applies really directly to the opportunity of electrification. And that's something that I've been really encouraged to see, this sort of work from the OGA and the sort of focus of the energy integration report, looking at this, and our area of focus really does overlap with the sort of different the different methods and the different issues associated with that. So the sort of first thing, I suppose, is green hydrogen, which is emerging as a significant sort of opportunity, particularly for offshore wind, particularly for offshore hydrogen production. There's a really exciting Dolphin project that I saw in the newspaper, and I've had some engagement with them recently. They have funding from BEIS to look at offshore electrolysis and how that could work, and it really does seem to be making strides towards commercialization in the short to medium term. And hydrogen production has become a real area of focus for the offshore wind sector deal, and I know the North Sea energy transition sector deal was looking at emerging, and there's some parallels there, some real areas of alignment around the sort of the way that this could develop, and the sort of opportunity on this demand side for green hydrogen seems to be almost endless, with the European reports and the good work from the Scottish Government in their hydrogen impact assessment and studies on that. So it really does seem to be a sort of demand-led thing just now, and I think the combination of green hydrogen really can make a contribution to that. Blue hydrogen obviously has a significant role in that too, and I won't patronise you by going through what is CCS, because I'm sure you all know much better than me. But we have a real interest in developing the carbon capture and storage market in Scotland. It's absolutely necessary to reach the net zero commitments according to the CCC, and it seems like an extremely direct way for that integration and transition to occur, utilising the best of the North Sea assets and knowledge. So we're obviously aware of the Acorn project. We're working with them to deliver in the early 2020s, and there's some exciting opportunities there with them too. So lastly, sort of overall, we're extremely supportive of the energy integration aspirations, and we're really looking forward to engaging with industry and all the different parts of government that OGA managed to pull together and deliver the integration report with. And I really do feel that there's shared ambition and interest in delivery quickly across all of those parties that I've engaged with so far. We recognise that there's specific requirements for both greenfield and brownfield electrification. There's significant opportunity with CCS and the repurposing of infrastructure, and there's real opportunities to work with others as part of the energy integration delivery. So we're very excited to be involved, and it really does look like there's short-term and medium-term opportunities that we'll be pleased to help deliver. So I'll hand back now to Carlo to sort of move us on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin. And it's my pleasure to welcome Myrtle Dawes, the Solution Center Director of the Oil and Gas Technology Center.
All right, thank you, Carlo, and thank you to the other speakers. And I'm briefly going to go through the presentation I've got here, and I'm going to try not to repeat because a lot has been said to date, which I definitely agree with. So I think for us at the Oil and Gas Technology Center, I'll just introduce ourselves, just so I know a few of you might not know what we do, but our company was formed back in opened the doors really in 2017, formed early and late 2016. And what we are doing is we're really focused on technology and driving that innovation. And we started with a very simple premise around fixing some of the issues today, talked about unlocking the potential of the North Sea. So, you know, look how wide that discussion has become now, and really transforming for tomorrow. And so we really work very closely with industry. We've co-invested with industry £150 million to date. We've screened over 1,000 technologies, and we've approved 237 projects, and we've got 54 of those in field trials. So really exciting place to work. So when we talk about the energy transition, we also have been looking at how we can support that. And, you know, building on the work that the OGA did in terms of any integration, what we decided to do was also to see what we could imagine in terms of what that would look like. So the first slide I have up here is really how are we going to turn this potential into reality, and what are the technology challenges ahead. So if you look at this current slide, you see that we've got the North Sea, really the remit primarily of oil and gas at the moment, with subsea structures, the odd FPSO. Now we've got the emerging wind, mainly close to the shore. And then we are really exporting our products to the industrial clusters at the heartland of our country, and it's used for power, and it's being used for petrochemicals, and also going for domestic supply. So the issue for us is, what is the 2050 imagining of this? Because that's the only way that we can then put a pathway and roadmaps together for what type of technologies we might need. So the next slide looks really, really busy, and this is the imagining that we think it might look like, which we did in conjunction with WoodMac. So again, now we see it's very much busier. We have lots of sectors working together. I'm going to start with oil and gas first. So we still see a role for oil and gas as per the CCC report. And what you see here is that we might have offshore wind providing clean renewable energy for us to be for oil and gas. We see what we call energy hubs, another feature from the OGA report, where we bring into close proximity these different technologies so that we can, from I suppose now, understand the technical challenges of this integration, but in the future have a platform where this is all integrated, underpinned probably by digital technologies that can be leveraged across the oil and gas, renewables, any hydrogen facilities we have here. So what you also see is that we've got electrified FPSOs. If we're going to do that, we see that we're still going to have subsea developments. We're now calling them subsea factories. They're very smart now. We've got hydrogen transport. We see that that will be something that's an opportunity for us. We see CO2 transportation, where pipelines may not be relevant, where we can use this to potentially inject into some of our reservoirs. We see green hydrogen production alongside blue hydrogen production, as was mentioned before. We see CO2 injection facilities. Again, we've talked about the demonstrators and the projects which are starting in that area. We see that we want to repurpose some of our existing pipelines so that they can, so we can keep the cost down as we do some of this transition. But you also see that those industrial clusters that we talked about, they can now also export the CO2 that they may have offshore so that we can store it safely underground. And you see that the domestic supply also can now have access to that hydrogen that we are producing. There's other technologies. You can see there we've got CO2 direct air capture, which is quite useful if you've got, because this can be placed anywhere. And again, I've got to push back to the digital and offshore operations control center, which we envisage will then control all of this. So for us, really, really fantastic opportunity in terms of the imagination. But the question is, can we deliver such a challenge? Well, the first thing is we should want to, because there's an enormous amount of value in there, especially if we move quickly on the technology and anchor that technology here in the UK, especially from the perspective of IP, which generates an enormous amount of value, but also the manufacturing jobs. And so we come to jobs where we think that there'll be around another 200,000 jobs being created as we become more resilient and using our own energy and using the North Sea effectively. And the last thing, I suppose, is that if we invest at pace to realize this value, we can really be a world leader in this area. And I think that's an aspiration that we should want. It is a challenge, but we should turn this challenge really into an opportunity. So then if I go into what did we do with this, the next thing we did is, well, what are the challenges? What is the roadmap to getting to this? And I think the first thing, and people have mentioned this systems thinking, we do need to understand and manage the interdependencies. Otherwise, this will be very inefficient. So alongside the technological innovation, I think we also need to combine that with the regulatory and the policies so that they are aligned and harmonized. I think the second thing is then when we look at this, what we see is that we are going from 4 distinct industries or themes, whether it be offshore, wind, hydrogen, or CCUS, all the way over to a very integrated system where each of these are now part of one cluster. And just to say a few of the key things here, one of the things that we decided to do is start that integration now. So we've got an alliance that we formed with the Offshore Renewable Catapult, where we can look at some of the specific challenges that we have today. And with regards to the technology, it is said many times that this technology exists today, and that absolutely is true. But the question is, does that technology stack give us energy which is affordable to the domestic users and our business users? Because if not, then we do need to innovate and get that. And then have we got this technology so that we can electrify, say, our oil and gas facilities? Absolutely. But is it at the right price point to make those projects investable? So for us, the key is that we continue to innovate on the current technology. We need to make it more efficient so that the energy that's generated compared to the work that's done at the very end, we lose as little as possible. We need to make sure it's sustainable. And I think we definitely need to make sure that it is affordable. So that's in terms of what we see in terms of the key areas that we need to work on. And this document that I have here, or this picture, is available on our website in terms of the document where we have looked at some of these key innovation needs that we need to address. And you see some of the things, for example, on saltwater electrolysis, so that we can harness the North Sea as opposed to using fresh water. You'll see things in terms of clean fuels for turbines, where we are also working with several companies on innovation there, which is good for offshore and onshore. And then, you know, we see things around commercial scale marine energy, and we shouldn't forget the wave and tidal resource. We are an island, it's abundant. We need to innovate and get ways of unlocking that and making that part of the mix. So I think finally, I just want to thank you. If you want to ask me any questions on any of that technology and those technologies, please put something in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Myrtle. And I would like to gather all the panelists together to have a bit of discussion and answer some of the questions that are flowing from our chat. The first, a little bit of feedback from the audience. The audience is more or less equally split between oil and gas and renewables, and with the good participation of suppliers. The main interests that our audience voted on were to understand the role of oil and gas in transition, but equally to understand UK net zero and energy transition scenarios, and the offshore renewable expansion plans. And I think we touched on all these topics in our presentation. Last but not least, understanding technology development and role of suppliers. So, and you, Myrtle, touched on that as well. So if I go through some of the questions that are flowing through the chat box, and let me just one seems to, for you, Bethan, the oil and gas and the energy industry more in general have undergone many changes over the past years and decades. Is there anything different this time with net zero, and what is different? And how is your company and the industry preparing and planning for that?
Thanks, Carlo, and really good question. It is different and it feels different. So in the UK today, I would say we have unarguably unprecedented agreement on the importance of delivering net zero, and we know the key elements of what needs to happen. So we feel at Shell, and I strongly believe that there's a need for leadership and collaboration to drive this delivery. And I think that was a theme running through each of the presentations. So we've all got to work with government as it does the thinking of the long-term structure of the energy system out to 2050. And we need to continue the pace in making progress on those policy and regulatory frameworks which are needed to release the investment, whether that's on CCS, hydrogen, electrification, or offshore wind.
Thank you, Bethan. Let me read a few more questions that seem to have and I suggest who can take them. But of course, I mean, if any of the other panelists want to add to the answers, feel of course free. So I'll move to the next question, and that seems for Will and potentially also Colin. What do we learn from the offshore wind power success story in the UK? What could be the potential bottlenecks to expand on such a successful story to date, and what do we learn in terms of that is useful for other emerging technologies like CCS, hydrogen, and potentially also floating wind, if you look at that as a different variation on the theme?
Okay, Colin, so I'll take that first. So I think the theme there is what do we learn from the last 10, 15 years? And it's really interesting. I think one of the things that stands out to me, so when we kicked off on round 3, we were talking, this is back in sort of 2009, 10, that was the real expansive point for the sector. So we were moving from some sort of 7 gigawatt portfolio to in excess of 30. And we, again, I keep using this word that comes to mind, what we did at that time, both in terms of us as Crown Estate, but also working with then DEC and working with the industry, which ultimately became the Offshore Wind Industry Council, we did programize certain elements of this. The first one was health and safety. We were going to get to a situation where the level of activity, the demand in terms of vessels, for example, the scale of what we'd be lifting was going to fundamentally move on at pace. And so what we did is we got together and started thinking about what do we need to have in place in order to manage those sorts of issues well. And so things like G+ were born, and that is the industry forum that pulls together, in fact, not just UK, but across Europe, actually, to look at the safe systems, what's the data telling us. The other big example there was we started to set an evidence base around the ambition for cost reduction. And at that time, we had what was probably privately, people didn't believe we'd be able to make it, a target of getting below £100 per megawatt hour by 2020. And we're now below 50. And I think my other sort of lesson out of that is not only did you get a point of providing a good evidence base that provides not only the leadership Bethan's talking about, but an evidence base to compel to take action and to monitor that action. But I think we all underestimated the ability through both in terms of innovation and the presence of competition to drive that price down now way below half of that target. And I think we all sat in the background thinking with our fingers crossed that we had to pull that off, but the industry really delivered against that. So with the correct incentives, with the right, activity, putting people in the seat to actually work at these problems and really defining the problems well and providing clarity across the board for the various actors, that clarity. And I love the chart that we just looked at on the last presentation around those pathways, those sorts of issues, and then mobilizing the ability of the industry to tackle those issues has been an incredible journey for offshore wind. And it's why we just made it in time. The cost reduction down with the increased ambition of net zero has just hit the sweet spot for it. Positive lessons. There's also some negative points, and I think I touched on it earlier. Just tackling these things from a project by project approach, not really stepping back and looking at, I guess, one of the strategic solutions. Well, I think we did quite well on the narrative I've just given you in terms of focusing and programming the issue, which was probably easier with one sector, probably more difficult with 4 sectors. But we still tackled this way in which we just tackled one project at a time. And that's really come to become quite acute in terms of the consenting processes and dealing with the grid position, for example.
Thanks, Will. And do we, Colin and others, do we want to perhaps expand on what of these lessons learned are applicable to the emerging technologies and solutions like CCS, hydrogen, and floating wind, which of course, play in adjacent but also different fields of technology?
I'm sure. I'll start. So I think, just to build on what Will was saying, the offshore wind industry has shown that it's been very responsive to market signals and been very capable of dealing with change in the way that support is given, and be able to sort of deliver in the face of change and with the need for innovation at the same time as cost reduction has really been very impressive. And I think the evolution into deeper water, a different technology, turbine size, growth, and all the rest have really been able to move on in the context of that competition and cost reduction, which I think is really positive. And I think partly the sort of clarity and structure and coordination of the sector deal activities. In signing the sector deal with UK government was a really major milestone, I think, for the offshore wind industry, and has really seen that sort of structure that Will's identified as being capable of coming through with full visibility of all parties. And I think that the sort of I'm really like the idea, and I'm really supportive of the North Sea sector deal that's emerging. And I think some of those connections within industry and within government can occur as a result of that process, as well as the sort of delivery of that outcome. And I sort of feel if you're looking for floating wind or hydrogen or any of these things, I kind of feel like the offshore wind model of sort of being capable of responding to market signals and being capable of commercializing things. There's a session later about corporate PPAs, for example, about different routes to market, about really pressing into the finance community and understanding how risk is priced and how it's tolerated is a really important part of anything moving from early TRLs and pre-commercial through to significant deployment. So I think that would be my inputs to that.
And Carlo, if I can build on that further as well on Will and Colin's comments, that what I see really encouraging action and work on collaboration for both CCS, where we've got the Carbon Capture and Storage Association working very closely with BEIS, and then the recently set up Hydrogen Advisory Council. So it's all about collaborating with a broad industry participation, supply chain, looking at that whole integrated value chain so that there isn't one project or one company trying to solve all the issues together, and setting up those ways to kind of that programmization that Will mentioned, like how can we basically build on that approach for CCS and hydrogen is going to be really important, to share the learnings and to work very closely with all of the regulators involved, because there are a number, as well as with government, to get these projects going and going quickly.
Thanks. Moving, Myrtle, unless you have anything, you wanted to add anything, Myrtle? I guess the I guess the important thing from your presentation, Myrtle, is that we need to have clear roadmaps. And like Will said, we need to have clear plans, clear roadmaps. We need to understand the cost pictures. We need to understand the technology phasing in and how to build it in a way that it can be delivered efficiently. You touched on collaboration, Bethan, and there is a question here about are there hurdles to collaboration between oil and gas and renewables? And are the synergies real, and how do we prove them?
Good question. I haven't seen visible barriers. I think we at Shell have businesses in upstream as well as in new energy. So maybe it's easier for me to say because I see really good work going on both sides. So, you know, my involvement with OGTC as part of an upstream team is also then complemented by colleagues who are working with the offshore renewable energy catapult effort going on to look at offshore wind as well. So there's definitely work going on. I think we are looking at integrated value chains in oil and gas as well, to see, you know, to flow through some of those sort of the diagram as well that Myrtle showed is like, how do all of these elements intersect? I think the collaboration, the energy around the collaboration is there, and it's just breaking then that down into, okay, what each party can contribute, what we all need to do, and what our kind of, as in the sort of the sector deal speak, is what we can bring to the table, but also what we need in order to be able to make that contribution, what needs to be, what barriers that are maybe there from either whether it's a regulatory point of view or a certainty of investment point of view, like what can be identified and then worked on together to progress a positive outcome for all of the parties.
Thanks, Beth. And then from the government point of view, and working with Will, with Colin and other colleagues and other regulators, I can assure you that we are looking in an anticipatory way of how to avoid hurdles to the collaboration among the sectors. How to facilitate an integrated planning. If Will, yes, sorry.
I think I just put I think there are inevitably foreseeable barriers, as we would call them. But I think technology has the ability to deal with those in the past. I think so long as we're all compelled to come up with the answer. And I think what often happens is in a transition from sectors working within their own sector and then coming together, in the end, it requires difficult decisions sometimes, and those decisions need to be incentivized, whether that's compromising a bit on two projects to make them work together. History tells us that works well when we're around the table seeking to put, and someone talked about the other day, with the problem on one side of the table and everyone else on the other, if you like. And I think that's a really nice way of looking at this, but it does come to bear on people's economics on their projects and investment cases. And so I think there's a really importance to kind of start to preempt these, and before we get to a situation where someone's having to really trying to fight hard to keep their projects on the road and keeping their investment position going, is that we sort of preempt these and put the technology issues into them, whether that's co-location. I think it's a really important theme. I think that's coming out of this. Being able to understand how we can co-locate is going to be really important, because there's just not enough space out there to do all this in a single use on any kilometre of seabed. And I think those are the areas that we are particularly interested in terms of trying to understand.
Well, thank you. And that's a good segue to the next question, possibly initially for you and Colin. Do you see risks of overlap between offshore wind, CCS, and oil and gas leasing and licensing?
Will,
Colin,
do you want to start? Okay. We'll pass the parcel. Sure. So yeah, this is a really interesting area. It's obviously emerging really quickly. The development of CCS and the sort of opportunity there, the scale and nature of offshore wind development, the possibility of co-location or being as close to existing or possible new oil and gas infrastructure by design is kind of a newish concept. So I think we're all sort of we're all working to understand the sort of technical, commercial, and market and regulatory landscape that this fits within. And I think it does come back to that shared ambition that Will touched on, where yes, from a sort of business as usual perspective, things may emerge as issues, and I think we're moving away from business as usual, moving towards net zero delivery, which may mean that decisions and sort of management and partnership is much more prevalent, and everyone's much more willing to sort of press into those issues and find solutions to them. So I think that applies to all of these things, including the sort of consenting process, the sort of management of the seabed, the technical and the commercial sort of liabilities and all the rest. That will be a theme that runs through, and that's often the difficulty with pioneering projects, is it looks really hard because you're asking questions of people that they've never had to answer before. So the answer that you get first is, that's really hard, or we're not sure. You get multiple different answers from multiple different parties, and I think that reflects where we are in the journey. We've come really far from the early days of offshore wind deployment and the sort of possibility of CCS and sort of looking at that. And now it's a great sort of, it's a good outcome that we've got these issues to manage, which seems a bit perverse, but I think it really is a good outcome, and I think it will need to take into account all of those different factors from all of those different parties, which at the moment looks quite daunting, but I think with that shared ambition that seems clear to me, and sort of welcome the sort of emerging position from OGA on this, that where there's a will, there's a way, I suppose. Not a great technical answer, but very encouraging, right?
Thank you. Will, anything to add, or?
I think for the purpose of time, I think I'd only be repeating what I said on the previous question or what Colin talked to. So,
I propose we have less than 10 minutes. There are two important topics that I would like to expand a little bit with you. One is people, and the other is innovation. On people, we have a question coming from the oil and gas sector. We have an experienced workforce, highly skilled individuals in many disciplines. How can they find a place for themselves in the energy transition?
So I'll take that one, Carlo. So it's a really good question, and it's a really common question in Shell as well, in the numerous staff and team engagements that I've been doing this year. You know, I'm talking to our discipline engineering team tomorrow on exactly this topic, essentially. So first of all, I would say is we need to reassure people that there is a significant role for oil and gas out to 2050 in the UK energy mix in any of the scenarios that we've discussed today. It will be less than it is today, but it still will be significant. So those skills are still going to be needed. And the decline of our own production is, without further investment in oil and gas, is going to be greater than the slowing of demand. And at the moment, we also only produce about half of what we consume in oil and gas in the UK. So we're importing oil and gas. So there's still a need for skills, you know, in the decades to come in oil and gas in order to maintain the UK's energy security and to provide that energy that is just embedded in our systems. But many of our skills are also really relevant in the energy transition. So when you look at, say, hydrogen and CCS, around process engineering, technical safety skills, construction of major projects, they're all really relevant skills that are transferable across these kinds of projects as well. So my advice to people is to the role of oil and gas is still there in the future, in the future decades. you can often get involved in the energy transition today already. So have a look around you in your own organization and what you can do. You know, in Shell, we need to reduce emissions from our existing assets. So we're working very closely with our operating teams on how we might be able to do that. But also be open to learn, you know, what are the technical skills when you look towards those topics that you've heard of today, and where, when we've talked about collaboration, integrated value chains, you know, perhaps it's also a different way of thinking. So sometimes it's just being open to listen to other industries and to see that there is going to be a lot to learn. For me, it's really exciting. Like, we really need to retain skilled workforce in the energy industry, and we need to attract new technical talent, and we know that that can be a challenge across the STEM subjects in the UK. So I would say, if we want to keep talent and we want to attract talent into the broader energy industry, from oil and gas right through to all the topics that you've heard of today.
Thank you, Beth.
Maybe, Will and Colin, you have something to add on the wind side?
Yeah, I think sort of highlight the skills as a key feature of the offshore wind sector deal, and there's an investment in talent group there that's really focused on looking at that sort of just transition in jobs and opportunity for offshore wind and the wider energy sector to collaborate. Basically, that looks at individuals and sort of smaller groups, I think, but it seems to be making real good progress on things like an offshore wind passport, which was a key feature of this sector deal, which would allow people to work on different platforms and different industries more easily. So that's something that is emerging and is well understood as an issue. I sort of read in the BBC that it's an issue, so it kind of must be true. So the other side of that is companies looking wider than just oil and gas operations. So an example I heard this week was Halliburton joined the deep wind cluster, which maybe is a small thing, but it's sort of indicated to me that it's a key feature of the sort of thing that you're talking about, Beth, and where whole companies are starting to look at, well, maybe there's an energy transition thing here, maybe there's a market in offshore wind that really we can engage with. And I think that sort of scale from individual people looking to retrain and redirect their skills to whole companies doing it. I think there's Halliburton or other companies are available, but that's a good example. And I think that sort of those two paths to me seem both credible and both likely to deliver good outcomes. And I think it's a kind of shared ambition across governments and across industry to try and sort of maximize the skills and opportunity within the sort of UK economy to really sort of make the most of the short and medium term transition. So.
Thanks, Colin. I think we need to think about the energy sector as one sector, and the boundaries between and among the different subsectors are fairly permeable, like Bethan was saying, like Colin was saying. And is there anything you want to say in your experience, Myrtle, you having quite a cross-energy view? I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I didn't know. I think the opportunities, we both need to make them as companies, but individuals also need to take them. For me, when I look at what's required from a discipline perspective, I think the skills are there. And, you know, we are really in a period where the innovation on any of the skills is just moving forward. So even the stuff we know today is not the skills of tomorrow. So we really need to keep on learning. That is absolutely critical. And I think, you know, some of our focus is that we have to be and understand how we can innovate. You just have to know how that's done, which is to unlearn a bit of what you knew yesterday so you can innovate for tomorrow. And we have to be able to know how to embrace the disruption a bit more, because there will be some disruptive technologies came that we didn't expect, but this will make us more efficient, more energy, more sustainable and more affordable.
One last question, and then I think we probably are at the end of the time. Maybe we can start with you and see how much. The key opportunities for the supply chain.
I think definitely transferring some of the skills in how we manage the North Sea, and this is really, I think this is key between where we are now saying to wind, and all of it about foundations. It's about working in those meteorological conditions that we do. So key to do that is just to say, I'm going to go and work in that area and move and get closer to the other parts of the sector.
Thank you, Emma. Anyone else wants to add to the supply chain role going forward? Maybe Colin on floating wind.
Sure. I think really briefly. I mean, there's obvious opportunity with the sort of deep sea, subsea capability with floating wind as we move towards electrification. There's sort of interface points there too. So I think there's significant opportunity with the sort of UK Scottish supply chain that's been built up with the oil and gas sector and with the offshore wind sector so far to really take a lead with floating wind, and sort of now's the opportunity. The sort of the really well developed markets in the UK are capable of taking on this innovative technology and really developing it here, and then being able to deliver it here and also export opportunities. So in particular with floating, it seems like we're at the beginning of something, and the UK and the UK's supply chain are really well placed for that.
Carlo, we got time for just one more comment on that?
Please.
I think it's also, we've talked about a lot of actors involved with this process. I think where I come to, I think that the trade bodies have an incredible resource in that. And so from an offshore wind perspective, Renewable UK and Scottish Renewables in Scotland, they are very much connected into the work of the industry, quite obviously, as their members. And those things, the supply chain hubs, the work happening in the back of the sector deal, there are resources in place to answer that question. So I think that's a really important role, both they're on board with and they're available. So Renewable UK, Scottish Renewables, and there will be others on the oil and gas side as well.
So what closing comment, it looks like that net zero has really focused the minds and the minds and the aims of so many parts of our very important industry, the energy industry. And I thank you very much, all the participants, all the audience and our panelists for this very good discussion today. I think I should just remind that the video of this webinar and the presentations will be available on the website of All Energy. I think that brings us to a closing.
Thank you.